So, welcome to Designing Beyond the Happy Path, where I'm going to go through a lot of things that sometimes we tend to forget, so that you have kind of a whole idea of all the small little thingy that you might need to think about when you're designing a website, a product, or an online service. So, the first thing I would like us to think about is going beyond the default perfect state. Often as designer, we're like, okay, I'm going to design a screen, and usually it will be like the perfect screen, the perfect state. So we kind of imagine it a little bit like that. Like our website, our user is going to click, and then ta-da, we have the perfect page. Magically, everything happened, everything is perfect, right? Except, well, between this perfect page at the end and the moment the user click, there's actually quite a lot of different steps. And there's a little bit of some traps, some pitfalls in here, and there's a lot of things that might go wrong and that you might have to think about. So the first thing is your user clicks, the page has to load, but maybe it takes a little bit of time. So whether we're speaking about pages or if you work like me in enterprise UX and where you have components that need to load, at some point, if it takes a little bit of time to load, you need to inform the user like, okay, the click was taken into account, your content is loading, something is going to happen. So maybe at some point, we need to think about, okay, what is this component going to look like while it's loaded? Do we need a loader? Do we put a message? How can we like inform the user and help them make the wait a little bit more comfortable? So this happens at component level, but also at page level. Then amazing loader from my actual projects. So then let's say it has loaded. I have two questions for you. Did it work, or do we have an error? Like maybe it loads and eventually we have an error. It stops loading because you have a web service problem, because the page doesn't exist, things like that. So before continuing into the like my yes green happy path, we maybe need to think about our states. So I'm working in enterprise, and we have these pages where every single little tile on the page has its kind of own wrapper. And the cool thing is it's very split into small little APIs, which means that if I have a problem with one of the content, it's not going to break the whole page. Only this part of the content will be broken. But at some point, here again, I need to inform the user. It would be better, to be honest, to tell the user how they can kind of come back from the error if they can do something. Unfortunately, on my project, usually if we have a content that doesn't load, it might mean that another service is doing some updates, the web service is not available, something like that. So there's very little the user can do. Well, to be honest, they can refresh the page. Sometimes they can clear the cache, but then if it's still not loading, it means there's a technical problem and it's on us. But still, here, we're informing the user that, okay, the rest of the content, you have to imagine that this is nice content that loaded. The rest of the content is okay, but we have like one of those errors that is not going to my perfect, everything is loading, amazing state. And I need to have this state in my design system to make sure that if I have an error while it's loading, my user knows about it. Okay, next step, I'm continuing in the unhappy state, you were warned, is, okay, it loaded, it's cool, we have content. Yes, but do we actually have content? Because maybe at some point it loads, but the user doesn't have content for that. There's a lot of different possibilities where there's no content. If you think about an e-commerce website, for instance, the user is inputting something in the search. Maybe you don't have any product that is matching any of their criteria. Well, now you have to think about your empty states, your empty pages. So instead of having kind of basic 404 saying, oh, we don't have any content, you can actually be smart. So I really like here what Doc Martin is doing. I don't remember what I was looking for, but they're telling me they don't have any search results, but then they're also pushing some categories. Like, yeah, maybe you're interested into women's shoes, men's shoes, kids' shoes, and then they're pushing the bestsellers. So here I'm not stuck. I can launch the search again, but they're also like using this empty state as a way to promote and push some of the product. So they kind of find a very clever way to have a good no search result page. I'm working in enterprise UX, and this is as fun as this gets. So empty states also is sometimes a nice way to bring some little fun animation, to bring some illustrations. So we have a task manager native application. And here again, the goal of the task manager is actually that you complete all your tasks. So the empty state means, as a user, I've completed all my tasks, I'm done, I can go home, yay, fun. But it's a screen that I need to design at some point too. So here we have like a little illustration, a nice message like, yay, all caught up, something like that. So it's also kind of a way to bring interesting opportunities, show a little bit your brand, work around storytelling, work around UX writing, copy, things like that. And then sometimes you might not have any content because the user doesn't have any yet. So that's an example where we have a search and they can't save their search. The first time you arrive on our interface, you don't have any search saved by default because you didn't launch any search. So we are actually using the empty state here as an onboarding tool, and we are explaining to the user how can you get rid of the screen? What do you need to do in order to actually have content in this empty state? So it's very interesting because if you have user-generated content, your empty state, they can become nice onboarding tools. So how do we do that as designers? We do that on two levels. On the design system, we have our component and we have all of these different states that go beyond this happy path with the perfect content. So I have this, my container and my little tiles, and I have a loading state, I have an empty no data state, I have my errors, etc., etc. And on the story side, what we have a checklist. So when we are writing stories for specific content, we are saying, oh, by the way, don't forget to explain what will be the empty state message, something like that. So we have this kind of template to make sure that we basically don't forget about any of the states. And trust me, even with the templates, sometimes we forget about it, we review the story, and at the end, while testing, we're like, oh, snap, we totally forgot to have a custom message for the empty state, so we need to add that later. So even with best intention on all of that, sometimes some things slip through the cracks. So we have content. We are back in our happy path. What could possibly go wrong if you have content? Well, the question to ask yourself when you have content is, how much content do I have? Usually I'm going to design for the ideal solution, the perfect content I have in mind. But what happens is if I have too little content, or what happens most of the time for me, too much content. So usually as designer, we start with that. We start with, okay, what would my component, what would my page look like with the ideal amount of content? Gorgeous card. It's supposed to be a bookmark. We have operation, contract, counterpart, bookmark. We have 5 because obviously our users will only work with 5 items in the system. No, of course not. But this is kind of the ideal state. Then the question is, what if we don't have enough content? Usually it's quite easy. So here we only have 1. What I need to be careful about here is I need to communicate to the developer. If I have this tile in the middle of the page, what happens to the rest of the tile around? And since we have some responsive web design, they are just like able to shrink to the minimum height of 1 item. And then what happens when I have too much content? We could imagine a lot of things. So here, let's say I have more than 5 elements. I could maybe have a fixed height and pagination, and then the user would click through this to access the extra content. Or I could say I have a fixed height, but instead of pagination, I have a scroll bar. So there's actually not one size fits all. It really depends on the project. The idea is, for me, to think about what will happen if I have too much content, and then to have a design for that, so that my developer know exactly how they're supposed to implement that. And then our page is loaded, we have the content, everything is fine, but especially if you work with software as a service products, very like B2B oriented products. You will have users who will interact a lot actually with the content of your website or your products. So here again, we need to think about what will happen when the user starts interacting with it, what will happen when they start interacting with the contents and the components. So I'm giving you kind of a simple example, which is a drop-down. Usually a drop-down, you might say, okay, the drop-down opens and the person clicks and that's it. But there's actually a lot of things that happen if you interact with the drop-down with the mouse. First, you will hover the drop-down. So you need kind of an hover state, which is already a different state than the default one for your button. Then the drop-down will open, and then again, you have item within the drop-down. So you need to imagine and you need to communicate to your developer what will happen when they hover something, what will happen when they click something. So you have different states for your buttons, you have different states for your list items, etc., etc. So mouse interaction is usually the first thing we think about. And this is the kind of stuff I deliver to the developer. We call this interactive flow. So an interactive flow is kind of a step-by-step flow of how a user will interact with a complex component with different steps and trying to not forget anything. But then we don't only have mouse users, we have users who will interact only with the keyboard. So on top of mouse interaction, we need to communicate to the developer and kind of think beyond this happy path and say, okay, but what if the user cannot use a mouse? What if they're using only keyboard navigation? So then again, we have kind of the same interactive flow, but instead of documenting here the different states for the mouse interaction, I'm going to document on top of that all the different states about keyboard navigation. So that's the kind of deliverable that we have. It's also an accessibility deliverable, which is how do you open this thing? What happens when you focus on the button? You have the little gray thing around it. How do you go through the different elements? You use your up and down arrow. How do you close it, escape, etc., etc. And then maybe we have touch users. So a couple of years ago, I was talking to a friend who decided to have a portfolio, and they wanted to have something like that. They wanted something very fancy, even on desktop. They said, I want to have a portfolio, but I don't want to have the navigation. I don't want my navigation to have some text. I only want the icons. Then I asked, okay, but as a user, how am I supposed to understand what your icon means? It's like, yeah, it's easy. You just hover the thing and then it shows the tooltips and then you can see what it is. So first, it's quite annoying as a user to have to hover to know the exact thing I'm going to click on, but okay. But then also, if you are a touch user, what will happen is you will touch this thing, you will see the little tooltip for half a second if it's implemented on hover, and then it will vanish and the page will open. So maybe if it wasn't the right page, you have to go back. And yeah, you might argue, okay, it's one click back, it's not the end of the world, but at some point it brings more frustration. So what he had in mind was interesting, but actually it wasn't really accessible and not really touch friendly at all. So by the end of the day, what we did is like, yeah, you just put the labels and then it's touch friendly. It's more friendly for people with cognitive disability because they don't have to remember whatever they just saw when they hovered, etc., etc. So it's always kind of finding a balance and remembering not everyone is going to use a mouse when they will interact with our interfaces. And often keyboard users and touch users are considered edge cases, especially in enterprise, because we tend to work a lot on computer and sometimes we forget that some of our computers are actually those kind of fancy Windows tablets. So yeah. How can we do that as designers and not forget about anything? Well, usually what I deliver to my developer is my user flow, which is a flow of the different pages of my website or my native application, and how will user navigate through them. This really helps them understand how someone will interact with the whole thing and make sure we don't forget anything. And then again, what I just showed you, the interactive flow, I didn't create it for the talk. I really deliver such thing for the developer. So every time we are going to develop a complex component that requires a lot of interaction, we are going to make interactive flow for the mouse and for the keyboard. And yeah, for the touch here, it's basically working the same way with the mouse because there's nothing appearing on over, so it should be fine. Second thing I want to prepare for is scalable and conditional content. So this is more like very small little details, but it's again some stuff that we need to think about because developer will ask us a question. So I have this very nice example of a cooking recipe website. For my cooking recipe website, I have a component that is kind of a thumbnail of the cooking recipe. My ideal components look something like that. And I have like one line of the perfect size title that says gluten-free pan pizza. What happens if I have more text? Well, the cool thing is that technically with Flexbox, it's super easy to build. So that's the thing. But at some point, I might have developer who will ask me, okay, we are going to use Flexbox. What do we do with the stuff on the right? So the stuff on the right are the metadata. Do I keep it aligned at the top? So I have same spacing at the top and then whatever happens with the bottom when it stretches with the Flexbox? Or do you want me to use, I don't remember which Flexbox property, but I can center it. What do you prefer? Here again, it's kind of, I might not have to design all of that. I could just have a discussion with the developer who will say, look, I played around with the text, I make it larger, bigger. Do you agree that when it's bigger, we keep it at the top, or do you prefer something like that, etc.? But it's kind of this small little detail where we need to think about, especially if we start having user-generated content. It's the same fun with the little kind of gallery of cards because we love cards since material design. And usually with the cards is the same. All of our cards have the same content. In real life, we will have cards with different content. So what do we do here? Do we have a min weight and then we align the next thing? Do we have some white space? Do we use masonry? So that's just like two design decisions. So what happens again with my very nice grid if I have more content on one card or another? And again, there's nothing complex about that. It's just the kind of stuff that if I don't think about it as a designer, I will have developer who will come and ask me the question. And then, of course, we have user-generated content, and you imagine that you're perfectly safe, and then the description of your project will always be very, very small. And you design this for a small thing, and then you have your QA who says, oh, I found a project, and actually it's super long, and I have no idea what to do with that. So now in our design system, we have a lot of places where we have the option of show more, show less mechanism, which is we know that when we have a specific description, when we have certain things like comments, where it's not limited in the database, the joke is some user will input the Bible. So that's the joke between us. But like basically, we might have 300 characters or 3,000. Depends on the users. So what we have here is when we know that some of the fields might overlap or like grow super big, we built in our components those mechanisms where we have the show more, show less to adapt. And here as a designer, what I need to decide is where do we snip, when do we snip? So that's why I document here. After 40 words, we are going to snip, or for some other things, I have it in characters. So again, here is mostly design decision about having a mechanism to handle more contents. And then if you're lucky enough to work in multiple languages, you might know that some languages expand way more than others. So that's an example of Slack, who messed up the French version because in French, you don't have like one verb to say mute. You need to use kind of multiple words and it becomes super big. And I don't know what they did. They have like fixed with or something, but it's completely breaking the interface. So what can we do as designers here? Well, we can try to foresee when we will have a translation and make sure that we prepare on our interfaces to make sure that if we need to translate, we have something flexible, like that the text is going to be able to wrap on 2 lines, something like that. So a couple of tips regarding scaling content. The first one is become best friend with whatever developer has access to the database and asks them, do we have limits on the fields? What's the minimum? what's the maximum and what's the average. And most of the time, what I try to do is I try to find a design that will work with average, and then I prepare this workaround. So my show more, show less button for the edge cases, let's say, that have I don't know how many characters because someone decided to input a lot of stuff. So yeah, become best friend with your developers. If you have user-generated content, then you know exactly. If you're going for fake content, like I have to do because I'm not allowed to have actual bank data in my interface, what I'm trying to do is to have fake content that has the same structure length as real content. So I'm trying to I have like this cupcake ipsum, which is nonsense. But then at least the length is kind of the same of what it would actually look like to make sure that we can test it properly. And then for translation, you need to know it upfront. You need to make sure that that you prepare the interface for translation. And then if you have other languages, try to know which one they are. There's some math that you can do where you need to ask translator, but basically from one language to another, there's a scaling factor. I think from English to French, it's 1.5, which means French word would be 1.5 or 1.3, I don't remember, bigger. So you can anticipate these sort of things. And then yeah, prepare for more always, just in case, so that at least you know what's going to happen. Then we have conditional content. So this also happens again with user-generated content. It's not the end of the world, but we need to prepare for that. So if I'm supposed to have an image on my cooking recipe and user didn't provide any, developer might ask, okay, what do we do? One solution would be to say, okay, you know what, we have a placeholder, and for those cooking recipe, we have the logo, and that's basically it. Or we could say, if we don't have any image, we stretch the components, and then it will be displayed without an image. It's another solution. So here it's about communicating this sort of design decision so that the developer can prepare an HTML and CSS that is flexible enough so that if we don't have an image, the component is able to stretch. And then we have fun things like that, like if we don't have any votes, what do we do with the stars? It might be confusing. So here, if I look at it very quickly, I don't see any stars. So I might think, okay, the recipe isn't that good. But the reason why we don't have any stars is because we don't have any votes. So maybe here we might need another design. Maybe we could say, okay, if we don't have votes, we don't put the stars. We just put something that says no rating available to not mislead the user into thinking that this recipe isn't good. And then we need to decide what's the minimum amount of votes to make an average, to make the star kind of relevant, something like that. So here it's again discussing product decision and discussing with your team about this sort of thing. Or we can just not display anything at all, basically. So at the end of the day, it's really about, I don't need to design all of those things. I need to take these decisions. So I might not do all the components at all the size and all the time, but I will have discussion with the dev team to make sure that we communicate what is supposed to happen when the content is going to scale. And what we do at my job when we have such things where it's going to be very in the nitty little details, we do some developer designer reviewing. So I had a session last week with my developer where we had some content that was displaying a little bit weirdly. So he was showing it to me, he showed me some option, he was playing with the dev tool to show me different things he could do in Flexbox. And I said, okay, this could be nice. And then I kind of reworked a little bit the mockup. He reworked the component and we did some kind of back and forth to solve these kind of issues. So it's mostly about having kind of strong communication to make sure that you are going to be covering those edge cases. Then so I talked about adapting to the content. I can also adapt the layout to different constraints. So usually today, when we are building components, we are building them in different sizes. So if I give my example of my cooking recipe little thumbnail, I have a small, a medium, a large. You see where I'm going to that with that. I'm going to responsive web design. I might use the small and the medium for mobile / bigger mobile. I might use the large for desktop, and in between, I'll have breakpoints that will let me switch between one or the other. The other cool thing is maybe this component is going to be used in different sections. So maybe the large one will not only be used on desktop, but it will also be used on the main area. And the small one that was used on mobile might be used also in a sidebar. So this is where we have the concept of media query versus container query. Media queries in CSS, we've had them for a while. It's kind of a way to query the size of the viewport and say, if my device is smaller than this, then do that with the component. Container query is brand new and is a way to say if my container, like my parent, so here my sidebar in yellow, is bigger than that, do this with the component. If it's smaller, do that. So the very cool thing is now with container query, we can actually build component that will adapt to whatever context we display them. To do that in Figma, that's a very cool thing. It's a little bit tricky, but you can fake them. So usually what I do when I want to fake container query or media query, I have my component and I have auto layout mix max width. So I will go play to the components until it stretches. And I'm like, okay, you know what? Here it's going to be a little bit weird. So with variants, I have my small version versus medium version. And then I'm kind of going to play around and say, yeah, it's kind of around this area that we need to switch. And then I'm documenting this like that with the different size of the component. And I have I have the I don't remember how it's called in English, like the tilt, to say approximately around this is the max size for this container, and it's going to be the max size for the responsive one as well. So we can already do quite a few cool things in order to anticipate those in Figma. And then at the end of the day, we discuss with the developer about the implementation. Credits were due. The way of documenting this was inspired by Christine's article. I can share it in the note if you want. And she wrote a very cool article about container queries in Figma. You might want to take a look. So yeah, here again, my message here is, as designer, we kind of need to try to let go of pixel perfection. And we need to stop obsessing over having the exact same thing in the mockup and in the final product, because it's not going to happen. So my advice is design in tool, design in the browser. Which is going to get worse with the next thing, which is we can also adapt our design to user situation. So the first adaptation is user preference and environment. Imagine you have your perfect design, but actually, for accessibility reason, your user decided to increase the text to 200%. Well, you have to respect that first. So you should not block the zoom level. And then, yeah, you need to make sure that when the user is going to enlarge the text to 200%, it's not completely going to break your interface. So you could design the mockup at two different sizes. I don't think we have time for that. What I would advise here is inform your developers, inform your testers that they need to test it with double the size and make sure that no content is missing and that it's not breaking. Then we have dark mode versus light mode. So we can manually switch to dark mode and light mode, but there's something in CSS that is a media query that is called prefers color scheme, where the browser is able to detect, does the user prefer dark mode or light mode? And then you can automatically switch your website based on their preferences. The cool thing is in Firefox, you can kind of say, I want the same as my device, or you can force and say, even if my device is in dark mode, I still want all the website in light mode. So that's about respecting user preference. And that's the very cool thing is now you can basically in CSS check what did the user prefer in their operating system. You could bring this one step further. Like, I don't know if you've used, I forgot the name of this GPS, Waze, but Waze basically is using the luminosity sensor of your phone. And when you are in the night or when you are in a tunnel, it detects that there's not much light and it automatically switches to dark mode. So we could do something like that. We could imagine some interfaces that is able, it's more like native application because you need to have access to the sensor, but interface that is going to be able to adapt to whatever environment the user is in. Then we have more media queries. You can detect, did the user switch on an accessibility feature that is called higher contrast? And that's the demo. So what you want to look at is the link. By default, they're kind of light purple. And if the user asks for higher contrast, so you see my operating system is in higher contrast mode, and then the website is also automatically switching. So there's a lot of things that we can do with that. There's more than that. You can test all of this. I'm not going to detail them all, but basically in iOS, in Android, in Mac, and in Windows, there's a lot of accessibility option. And with CSS, we will be able to query all of those. Inverted color, forced color, reduce data, transparency, all of that, and adapt the website based on this. Then we can also imagine adapting the website based on user situation. If the user doesn't have connection, we can actually detect that on the web. That's a very cool thing. And we could imagine things like that. So Financial Tab Weekend, what they do is they're going to cache today's edition, which means that if you come back later, then you can actually see the whole edition today from the cache, even if you're offline. Sarah Sweden has a blog where you can save a page for offline, and then even if you come back, you don't have any connection, you can still check the pages. So that's an interesting thing to say, like what happens with my website if my user still wants to access the data without having connection? We can start thinking about that and designing into this kind of idea. And then like what happens if they have connection, they lose it, and they need to synchronize something. Here again, we have even more states for our components. So if you think about Gmail, for instance, you want to send an email and you are going to send it, but you lose connection. What you have is your email is going to stay in this kind of outbox, and then it's automatically sending it. If you think about Dropbox or Google Drive, for instance, if you're trying to synchronize data in the use connection, you need this kind of synchronization fail state that says, okay, it's not synchronizing, but then we need a state that says synchronization is back and we are currently trying to synchronize your data. And then maybe you want to say to the user this was successful. So you need a new state that would be, okay, synchronization success. So it's very edge case, but if you start thinking about native application and having way to kind of postpone synchronizing things when the user is losing connection, you need to think about all of the states. So this is where it becomes funny, because basically the only way to design that is to do user research. You need to understand the user context. Like, will they be in a context where you lose connection and things like that, to make sure that you can actually foresee all of those very cool features. And then reach out to your developers, because they know the capability of native application, they know the capability of the web, and they might surprise you. They might kind of bring you feature and say, you know what, we can actually do that, this and that with this kind of features, and then we can really adapt this interface to whatever user, whatever situation the user is in. So my message here is, at the end of the day, it all kind of comes down to balancing building the right thing and building the thing right. And I'm quoting Laura Klein here. And I think we can have both. We can build the right thing the right way. But for that, we need kind of more collaboration between designer and developer to make sure that we don't forget all of those states, all of those edge cases, all of those kind of opportunities. And also, like, collaborating means if someone forgets about something, it's perfectly fine because you're part of the team. And then someone else might say, oh, by the way, did you think about this state? Oh, no, but now that you're telling me, okay, I'm going to do it. So it's really about having this kind of a collaboration to make sure that the edge cases are not edgy anymore and just become part of the whole design process. And that's it. That's all I have for you today.
All right, well, excellent. Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was wonderful, incredible. By the way, dear friends, if you're interested, there is an incredible amount of stuff that Stephanie has put together on her blog, all around accessibility, documenting accessibility, and many different UX kits that you might find very, very useful as well. Stephanie, we have a couple of questions that came up, and I want to bring, well, two of them before we go in a panel. One of them is very strategic, I would say. The question is, what are, in your experiences, convincing arguments for POs or PMs for including edge cases into product development?
Okay, my issue with that question is PM project manager or product manager? Because it's not the same job. For me,
Yeah.
PM is project manager. So I will answer that as if PM was product manager. And for me, it's basically what I said is it becomes the responsibility of everyone. So if you start if you start thinking about the edge cases in the earliest stages of the process, then they become part of the process.
Mm.
So they become part of the stories. And I showed it a little bit at the beginning. We have this checklist where we have on my project the PO are the one writing the stories, and we have the checklist so that they don't forget about a lot of those things. And in the checklist we have basically what is the error message, what is the message if the tile is empty. Usually it's very structured. It's like there is no to display, but sometimes you might know why there is no. So you might add a yeah, there is no to display. You want to. So we have this kind of checklist, and I'm pushing them to use the checklist whenever we write new stories. But yeah, it's
Mm.
a work of progress. So I would say awareness and use the checklist if you need. Like make a checklist of stuff not to forget, and eventually we start like repeating and repeating. And
Yeah, and eventually it kind of becomes a second nature where you just work with it as a process. It's just a matter of getting used to training, learnability, things like that, right? Another question is, what do you think? Who should actually own edge cases? Should it really be designers or actually QA and testers?
it's always the same. It really depends.
Yeah.
If as a designer you can foresee the edge cases, then I don't like the idea of ownership on that, because it
Mhm.
means that if I'm not the owner on that, I don't care, which happens a lot. Like maybe not if you're like a decent human being and you're like, yeah, even if it's not my thing, I don't own it, but I'm still going to it. So for me, it's part of the designer's job, but it's also part of the QA to test. So often I partner up with the QA, and the cool thing for me is my QA is reviewing the story. So sometimes they would say, oh, I know of a specific item in the database that is going to break your design. Let me show it to you. So for me, the honor is whoever is in the position of knowing there will be an edge case, something might completely break. And sometimes you miss it. Like we had a page that we migrated, and we migrated the way we saw it, and we didn't check the code because I'm not a developer. And then it went to production, and the user told us, yeah, but I don't understand, I don't have content for that. It's like, how can you not have content? And then we investigated, and there was a if else in the old stuff, and the only person who could have seen that would have been the developer, because
Mm.
me, I didn't have the data set. He could have seen that, oh, actually, no, there's this edge cases, which is if the stuff is in this position with that product, with that, we have another table to load. And then, okay,
Mm.
the table, they didn't have the table. Next sprint, it was kind of top priority to bring the table. And, like it happens, you mess up, you can't be perfect, you can't like know everything, especially if you work with super old systems and the code is spaghetti and all of that. So for me is whoever discovers it or is most likely to discover it should just talk about it, and then as a team you solve the problem, and that's it.
Right. I think it's also interesting that I think many issues really come from localization, because when we are working on projects, sometimes translating text strings into Greek, um, some of those very lengthy things that we're translating become
Yeah.
very, very different. And sometimes not all languages are available, not all translations are available. It's kind of a story in its own. And this is where you can get to a lot of remarkable edge cases, if you like, but then you
Yeah,
actually have to accommodate for that, right?
but you get used to it. Like we
Yeah,
know
yeah, yeah,
we
totally. Mm.
longest name in the data, like longest name that cannot drop because you don't have like hyphen is a Greek name, 25 characters, something like that.
I
So we
think
know
could
that
be,
when we
yeah,
need to test a name, that guy's name.
that
Like,
Greek works.
you're my
Yeah,
long name
yeah,
test case,
exactly, exactly.
basically.
And maybe the final question before we go on a panel with the other speakers is, do you actually have a recipe website? That would be awesome! Exclamation mark.
Okay, so the pizza one is a gluten. It's actually it's real picture. There's a real recipe, and
It's really gluten free.
it's really gluten free. I don't remember. I think it was on CSS Tricks or something. Like we put the recipe somewhere on the web. So if you want the recipe for the gluten free pizza, yes, it's somewhere. I need to ask my developer where we put it. But yeah, no, I have my recipes in Keep.
And keep,
So it's not
okay.
public, but if you want the recipe for
I
the
think
pizza, I
this
can
would be the
send
most successful open source project ever released.
it.
Stephanie's recipe, gluten-free pizza for everyone. I think this would be tremendous success. Well, thank you so much, Stephanie. For now, I'll bring you back in just a few minutes. And please, dear friends, thank Stephanie by sending a wonderful round of gluten-free pizza in the chat. That would be very much appreciated. All right, Stephanie, see you in a bit.